I'm pleased to announce that President Trump's meeting and long-awaited meeting with President Xi in China will now take place in Beijing on May 14th and 15th.
Summit in Beijing, but it sounds like the only topic isn't going to be what's going on between the US and China. It's clearly also going to be about the war in Iran. With me today are Mيتشل and Kامينسكي, and we are going to be launching right into it. Min, how's China positioning itself in this war?
Nice to be here. Thanks, Andre. First of all, I think China, using a phrase my friend Evan Medeiros used, China is being calculated. China is exercising calculated neutrality in this war. China does have a commercial and trade interest a lot in the region, but China also doesn't want to shoulder that security commitment. So coming to this war, we have seen China did a lot of behind doors diplomatic efforts to mediate, but hasn't come out to back up Iran militarily or in other ways to get engaged.
Well, I thought it was interesting that China, as with Venezuela, we had thought at the beginning that this is another loss for China. You know, they lost an ally in Caracas in Venezuela, could do nothing about it. And you saw the U.S. military do something the Chinese military can only dream of, at least for now. And the same, I think, the same held true at the beginning of the Iran conflict, that again, the U.S. did something that the Chinese would be hard-pressed to do. You had the regime top line was decapitated, and China was almost forced to not say very much because it felt like it was impotent. But I would say if you're is it chairman or president? I never know.
Chairman.
Xi, Chairman
Both,
Xi,
both.
both president and chairman Xi, you are probably thinking, this is turning out pretty well for me. You got America is kind of bogged down with Iran. There is no clarity on when this could end. Yes, there's some economic pain for me, but whatever hurts my enemy is good for me, and this seems to, at least for the time being, be hurting the U.S. And I wonder, man, I'm kind of curious to ask you is, aren't we seeing the Chinese lean a little bit more into this? And I saw some reports about Chinese, was it arms shipments or economic aid for Iran? You had the Iranian foreign minister go to Moscow, which is obviously the mini-me to Beijing. I get the sense that Chinese may not be as calculatedly neutral as they were at the beginning.
Well, I think in Washington, you're right. There are two debates going on. Is this war, is a weakened Iran means China is losing advantage and that weakens China, or a war that weakens Iran is actually good for China because the U.S. is distracted, and that's the debate that's been going on since this war. If we're sitting here being chairman or President Xi, I would definitely see this as a huge bargaining opportunity because the U.S. is distracted. The resources are restrained. So for the U.S. going into these talks, there are a lot of trade-off the U.S. may have to make.
What can the Chinese give the U.S.? What the U.S. wants?
The U.S. wants fentanyl, trade deals, agriculture deals.
Fentanyl to stop, not more fentanyl.
Oh no! No more no more fentanyls. More soybeans. More agriculture purchases from
Right.
China. And the U.S. wants China to on the Iran stuff. Beijing has officially denied those reports. They didn't supply the chemicals. They didn't supply military. We don't know what's really going on, but that's going to be an interesting point to see how much China would give on Iran during the summit.
They didn't supply any weapons to the Russians, and it turned out that they did in the end. Just kind of pulling on this thread, is what can the Chinese do to help the U.S. in Iran, and in exchange for what?
I think diplomatically, China has been playing a role to bring the region, to bring Iran to the negotiating table. And that may be something, as we have seen, that China brought Pakistan to mediate a previous ceasefire, whether it's fragile or not. but it did deliver, and most people see that as a goodwill gesture leading up to this summit. So I think that's one front that China could show its influence on Iran to sort of help the U.S. to untangle this impossible situation.
So there's this 25-year secret agreement, or at least the agreement is public, but what's in it is secret, that Iran and China signed a few years ago. And, you kind of wonder what was in it. Clearly, there was selling oil at a reduced rate, which of course helps Iran out. And of course, it helps out China. China is somewhat reliant on it, but of course, Iran is much more reliant on that income. But you kind of wonder what is in that agreement and how much has that agreement been tested? Like, how serious has the Chinese commitment to Iran been? Because it's not bowling any of us over that, I mean, clearly they haven't rushed in with anything military. It sounds like, in general, I mean, they get to sit back and they're not really responsible they don't owe Iran much. And they probably are pretty happy to see the world distracted and not paying attention to the South China Sea and to Taiwan and so on.
Yeah, that agreement reportedly, China is supposed to invest $400 billion in Iran's economy. We haven't seen any evidence of that investment coming to life. In exchange, China wants discounted oil supply from Iran. So I think people bring up this. It is, at the time, it was a massive agreement showing these countries may be closer than ever. But just in recent years, we've been tracking some data, and that hasn't shown up. It is a nice, I think it's a nice uh, diplomatic agreement at this point to show that they are some kind of in the alliance, but we haven't seen anything concrete out of that agreement. And I also want to mention um, China is Iran's biggest trading partner and biggest oil buyer, okay? But uh, China only, on China's purchase of oil, Iran's oil is only about 13%. So it's pretty clear this relationship is not balanced. Iran desperately needs China, especially after the war. And China is very pragmatic, very transactional. For them, from what I can see, whoever is calling shots in Iran this moment and onwards, they will find a way to do business with that person and secure their interests.
Yeah, it seems to me that also if you're like in the Chinese Foreign Ministry policy planning staff, you're exciting moment. You've got the thing playing out in Iran. You don't want to lose Iran, obviously, but having the U.S. again bogged down, having a lot of the U.S. Navy now deployed to enforce a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, as opposed to in the other strait they care about a lot more that separates Taiwan and mainland China. Second thing you're probably thinking about too is how do you reach out to the other Gulf states, which are also huge commercial partners for China and supply a ton of energy to China. These countries are potentially on the market for new allies, or at least to try and hedge their bets, because there's certainly, you pick up a lot of feeling in the Gulf states, less so the Emirates, which I think is very much clearly putting its chips on a future relationship with the U.S. That was partly why they pulled out of OPEC when they did earlier this week. But with the Saudis, with the Qataris, the Saudis, I think they do feel quietly miffed that they were not informed about the action against Iran, and they also feel kind of, they don't have as much faith in the U.S. alliance as they might have before the
Where do you think they
conflict.
would hedge in this?
I think a couple. I mean, I think foremost China. China, could China be a different sort of partner for Saudi diplomatically? Certainly less pushy on some things that the Saudis may not want to be pushed on. But the U.S. alliance was, if having U.S. bases in the region was what protected you in the past, suddenly the Iranians have shown some vulnerability by going after. And it's not an accident why Iran has launched a lot more missiles against the Gulf states than against Israel,
Right.
to show that
Let me ask
this
you,
is the
Matt.
price to pay for being in bed with the U.S.
Matt, you spend a lot of time, in the region, and you made some trips there. What's the sense you have of how things are going to be shifting? Because we're looking at, it's not just China and the U.S. It's like the global balance has shifted. The tectonic plates are bumping up against each other, earthquakes, if you will, volcanoes, uh, and we're trying to figure out what the post-conflict world could look like. What's the sense you get from your own experience and discussions with what's going to be different in the Gulf when this is over, and the Gulf's relations with the rest of the world?
This has become a global conflict in a way that we didn't fully appreciate probably in the first couple of days. We thought this was a fairly tactical, clinical almost attempt to, remove, to sort of weaken, or if not remove the regime, get rid of the Iranian nuclear program, and severely degrade the Iranian military. But it's turned out to be a conflict with global implications. And the short answer to that question, Andres, is it depends how it turns out. It depends how the U.S. plays this. I think the Gulf states will be watching very much to see, is Iran going to be strengthened or ultimately weakened, especially if it stays under the, we used to call them the mullahs, now we call them the colonels and generals inside the IRGC. It depends also how Israel emerges from this conflict, whether it is strengthened or weakened, and whether that, and I think we have to see how this turns out, then what happens with normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Remember, the Saudis really wanted normalization with Israel, not because they really cared about the Israeli part of it, but they wanted it because that would also come with a U.S. security guarantee, potentially in a treaty form. I just think that there's a lot more question marks around the U.S. commitment to those countries, in those countries right now, because of the way this conflict has played out. They're not lost to the U.S. But this is now a great power game, and it's really a great power game over the Gulf states, over the Gulf, and where do they end up? And I think we always there's a phrase a couple years back. These were geopolitical swing states. I thought that was overstated because actually they were really kind of condemned to be on the U.S. side. But I think this attack on Iran has put that back into play, and we will see 5-10 years from now. I think I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Gulf truly hedge their bets by striking closer, not just economic ties with China, and probably less so Russia, but maybe the Europeans, maybe the Turks, but also military and security relationships, and really hedging those. And that will be a sea change.
And it's interesting, you mentioned hedging and you just mentioned Russia as well. It's kind of interesting to watch the dance with Russia as well. The Iranian foreign minister has traveled he met with Mr. Putin recently in St. Petersburg. And, you have this kind of quiet relationship clearly between Iran and with Russia that's been going on for some time. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as well. You have President Trump and Chairman President Xi meeting each other, and Russia's kind of standing and watching, and they're basically observers now, and they can always play a spoiler role as they have often, but it's going to be interesting to watch what comes out of this. U.S.-Chinese relationships are strengthened. Where does that leave Russia?
Well, I think Russia is now used to being that, they're former superpower and not a pretender to current superpower to them, so they really don't belong in that room with China and the U.S. right now. I I think what's really and by the way, President Trump has and people around him has said, well, maybe we want to get close to Vladimir Putin because maybe we can move them away from the Chinese orbit. And I assume that's part of the reason, not the whole reason, why the Trump administration still is so indulgent of the Russians and of President Putin, which to listen to any Russian official, they're like, no, we don't trust the Americans. And actually, the Chinese are our friends because we have the same values and the same worldview. I would say just two things. One, on the European relationship. Russia, despite the short-term boon it is getting from high oil prices, I think is in big trouble. is in big trouble
Economy.
economically, internally, and much more so than we realize because the Russians have been trying to trick us about how good their economy is for the last 100 years, ever since the Bolshevik Revolution. They're also in trouble militarily. I think there has been a clear momentum shift on the front lines in Ukraine. The Russian momentum has been almost completely stalled. The Russians are bleeding massively. They're losing over 30,000 soldiers a month, which is they lost 50,000 in the Afghanistan war over a decade. The Ukrainians have, in some ways, because they were cut loose to a large degree by the U.S., have been forced to improvise relations, but also have shown that their innovation on the battlefield has strengthened their hand. And so interesting to see President Zelensky of Ukraine, going to Saudi Arabia, striking kind of military deals, sending his advisors to the Gulf. Like, we know how to fight Shahid drones. Stop firing off those $5 million Patriot
Right.
missiles. Here's a counter drone. It's cost you $5,000. We know this. And so the Ukrainians are now in an incredible, what a twist. The Ukrainians are a geostrategic player in the Gulf.
So it is a very complicated chessboard now. So if you were President Trump going to China in 2 weeks, we kind of know what U.S. wants, but he's also walking on a very tight rope, knowing all these dynamics, and a lot of people were looking at the summit. First thing is Taiwan, Iran, not comparable. But Taiwan is getting pretty anxious about this summit, given the situation, a distracted America, and what China has always wanted America to commit. What would be the best case a win for the U.S. coming out of this summit, you think?
Well, I think
It's a
first of
great
all,
question.
yeah, I think I'm curious, Andres, also for you, but I mean, first of all, I think it's surprising to see. I would, if I was President Trump's advisor, which I'm clearly not, but if I were, I would say, let's get back to who we were when we first came into office vis-a-vis China, and I think this should be the approach to Russia as well. We're the strongest military power in the world by far. We're leading on AI. We're the biggest economy still by a long stretch. And by the way, those graphs that were showing kind of China catching up in GDP share of global GDP, it was like it's gone like this because China is going down as a share of global GDP because it has serious structural problems in terms, demographically. It's still a highly inefficient, centrally planned economy. So you got to go in with you're the superpower. Similarly with the Russians, it still boggles the mind why the U.S. is so doesn't play the tough guy with the Russians. We play tough guy with the Europeans, with the Ukrainians, with all kinds of people, but not with the Russians and the Chinese. Let's sort of find that inner tough guy because that gives you, I think that puts you in a position to get the deal you want. What does he want? Obviously, I think you want to clean up these trade problems. Let's see, these are sort of self-inflicted wounds for the U.S. It's really hurt soybean farmers in Iowa, who, by the way, were a huge Trump voting bloc. And I think on Iran, you probably just want to make clear to keep the Chinese out of there, but also make clear because the Taiwan is not an issue just for the Taiwanese, which it obviously is. The whole world's watching, but especially Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, the closest allies in the region are watching what you are not just saying, but then what you're going to be doing. And any suggestion that we're moving away from that kind of Henry Kissinger strategic ambiguity around Taiwan to like, oh no, this is not our do what you wish, I think that would be really damaging to American power and interests.
That's a really good analysis. I wish I had President Trump's number on my
Well, many
speed
do.
dial. Yeah, there are many people recently in Washington been calling President Trump directly, talking about stuff. But yeah, I do think it is a critical summit. Of course, I would like to add later this year, President Trump and Chairman President Xi will have another 2-3 opportunities to meet. It is in Shenzhen for APAC and also in Miami for G20. So this is going to be a very interesting time, and this is going to be the first time for President Trump to visit China in 8 years. So definitely something to watch closely.
I mean, we thought that he would
And I
only
think
go
we
there
can't
once the war
underestimate.
ended. Sorry, Andres, but we thought he would only go, and he delayed it once for the conflict to end.
Define
That's true.
ceasefire.
Okay.
We can't underestimate AI and tech as part of it, and kind of how strict are the controls going to be on Chinese export of AI technology and the role of NVIDIA and so on. I think that's going to be really important. I think that may be one of the headlines coming out of this summit. Amidst all of the other stuff, Taiwan and other issues on the table, including Iran. I think there aren't going to be a lot of big breakthroughs. I can't imagine what there would be where there would be a lot of horse trading or a big announcement. But I think the one to watch is what's going to happen coming out of this on chip export controls and AI, because of course that's on everybody's minds anyway in everybody's lives. But I think it's a key issue now in the tug of war between the U.S. and China
Yeah,
that we're going to see. It's
absolutely.
going to be brought up.
Yeah, definitely. I think the AI stuff, the semiconductor, especially the high-end chips, export control stuff, is on top of the list. They will talk about it, and also for the region as well. China has been trying to. Not just trying, China has dominated the market in the Middle East, especially in the Gulf-rich countries about the AI application stuff. So that's something I think both sides are fairly aware of. What's the tension, the competition that the two countries are having over there.
100%.
I mean, I think it's also interesting that you had the assumption that what President Trump had really quite remarkably done in the first term is to, we were always China neutral. I think both parties we're not sure about the politics in Taiwan, but we want to do business with them. And he kind of made being a China hawk the default position for the U.S. That then a lot of the Europeans who were more than willing to go to try to strike commercial deals, suddenly it turned Europe, also made Europe China hawkish and skeptical. It's been interesting to see in the second term that the hawks within the Trump administration have been pushed out, and you have a much more accommodating approach on chips, for example. We were blocking them under Biden and early Trump. Now there's more openness thanks to the lobbying from Jensen Huang from NVIDIA. And I think you're also seeing a softening of the European position toward China, where they see China as also a good commercial partner because also there's so much trouble with the U.S. And Trump has an opportunity potentially, or probably some advisors of his are pushing him to back toward that more hawkish position. That's the thing for me that'd be very interesting to see whether, I mean, he so wants to
It
get
is,
a deal.
it's
He wants to get a deal, but it also goes against what he has said about China for so long.
famously, it was Richard Nixon, the famous anti-communist. He made his career in the House and the Senate and so on. I mean, his whole career was built on being, the most staunch anti-communist, and yet it was him as president who recognized the People's Republic of China and opened that door. And the seat on the Security Council was switched from Taiwan to China. I agree. Everything is possible, really, because it's going to be interesting to see whether the hawks win or the kind of more accommodationist people. But history doesn't necessarily dictate anything right now.
Yeah, I think given the war at this point, I've talked to people in the administration or close to the administration. One word I get is stabilization. Washington wants a stabilized relationship with China at this point, and vice versa, I think, because it is also unstable global order is not what China wants either. So we may not see a decisive breakthrough out of this summit. Maybe both sides will just manage expectations, sort of like repair the relationship a bit. That could also be an outcome that's welcomed by both sides.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think neither side wants a break of any kind, and they want this to go well, which is a good sign that it will go well by the terms that they've defined. But it also seems like this is not a Nixon going to China moment where you're going to get something kind of like a historical pivot to come out of this.
Yeah, I wonder, people always talk about wartime presidents have leverage.
Well, I mean, to use Donald Trump's favorite metaphor of late, his cards are not bad, but they're not as good as they could be coming into this.
That's a good way to describe it.
So as we kind of head toward wrapping up, let me ask both of you what you think the biggest news is going to be coming out of this summit. Like, what does your gut tell you now? Like, what's your feeling that we're going to be reading about, like, wow or not wow? They're going to stand at the podium and make an announcement together. What do you think is going to be the top line item that they're going to say?
I would think that the main thing, Donald Trump does not want the summit to be overly dominated by Iran. He wants to get back to talking about AI, about deals, about trade, and getting some kind of agreement. He likes wins, and he's a president who likes to likes wins, touts wins, does see himself as a business guy doing politics. And it's based on what we know about and we've heard from the Chinese, I think the Chinese would want to play along with that. And I don't expect this to be, it doesn't seem this will really change all that much how Iran plays out, unless really we count the Chinese do have sway with Tehran, and this would not be talked about as much, but maybe it's something that happens more behind the scenes, that if they have an agreement that the Chinese via the Pakistanis or whoever can get Tehran to do what the Trump administration really now wants, just to get this thing over with. That may not be the headline, but that would be the most interesting development to come out of this if it happens.
Yeah, to add to what Matt said, we may not necessarily have a wall headline. I think we're going to get really nice photo ops between the two leaders looking like two great power leaders. The U.S. will push through some trade agreements and stuff. I think at the end of this, both sides need this summit to go well in a time like this. So the rest of it, I think it's not going to be as not significant, but it's not going to have something too controversial. But of course, for Taiwan, this is something they'll be watching very, very closely, because any terminology concession means a lot for Taiwan.
And I agree. I mean, both of you. I think there will be headlines. I don't think they're going to be about Iran. They're certainly not going to be about Taiwan. I think what it would be, to go back to what I said earlier, is that it's going to be something. Frankly, it's going to be a headline if the U.S. continues the tech import restrictions, or if it loosens them. I think either one is going to be an interesting one, and I think I agree. There's going to be some sort of big win, something big coming out of it, and I think it's going to be about on the tech level. I think that's really what it's about. And on that note, certainly I want to revisit this in a few weeks' time, and we can grade ourselves on our predictions and see how we did on our headline predictions. And there's a lot going on. Stay tuned to future episodes of the MBN Iran Briefing podcast. I want to thank our tech team, and I want to thank my colleagues today for joining in another exciting episode of what's going on in the world and how it relates to Iran, as this does as well. Thank you.